Welcome back to Creepy Confidential. I'm your host, Noelle, your resident weirdo Wisconsinite. I open case files on my favorite cryptids, cults, conspiracies, and otherworldly creepy. Bringing you new cases, live broadcasts, local lore, and in Season 2, we bring you the Cult of the Month. So get ready, creeps. It's Season 2 of Creepy Confidential. September 19th, 1961, Lancaster, New Hampshire. Barney and Betty Hill are returning from their honeymoon in Niagara Falls, traveling back to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They changed their plans in an attempt to outrun a hurricane that was supposedly headed north toward their part of the coast. Betty notices a bright light outside her window in the night sky. However, she's a little perplexed noticing the light is moving erratically and in an upward position. Concerned that it is growing bigger and brighter, she urges Barney to stop the car to get a closer look and to let their dachshund Delcy get a little break. Barney pulls over at a scenic point just south of Twin Mountain. Grabbing the binoculars, she sees an odd-shaped craft with flashing, multicolored lights as it travels over the moon. Her sister had mentioned she had seen a flying saucer, and Betty ponders if that's what she's seen. Handing Barney the binoculars, he observes what he believes is a commercial airline on its way to Montreal. Soon his mind is changed as the craft rapidly descends in his direction. They quickly return to the car and drive towards Franconia Notch, a more mountainous stretch of the road. They continue slowly down the isolated road in an attempt to observe the craft's movement. The craft appears to be nearly 40 feet long and rotating. Approximately 1 mile from Indian Head, the craft rapidly advances towards their car. This causes Barney to come to a quick stop in the middle of the highway. The large craft hovers 80 feet above their 1957 Chevy Bel Air, filling the entire view of their windshield. Armed with his pistol at his side, he steps out of the car and looks up using his binoculars. He sees 8 to 11 humanoid figures looking out the large windows of the craft. All but one figure moves to an exit of the craft. One communicates a message to Barney. Stay where you are and keep looking. He sees the figures wearing black glossy uniforms and caps. Red lights on possible wings of the craft start to telescope outwards, and a long structure lowers from the bottom of the craft. He feels that these beings are not human. Barney tears the binoculars from his eyes and runs back to the car. And he tells Betty they're going to capture us. The hovering craft shifts to directly above the vehicle. Barney hits the gas and drives away as fast as he could, while Betty looks for the object out the window. Loud, rhythmic beeping and buzzing sounds begin to emit from the craft. The car begins to vibrate, and a tingling sensation passes through their bodies. Their minds enter an altered state, and their minds are suddenly dulled. A short time later, a second series of beeps and buzzing returns them to their consciousness. They realize that they have traveled 35 miles south and have no idea how they got there. They return home just after dawn. Barney realizes what time it is and how long it should have taken them to get home. He realizes that they're missing time. 2 hours to be exact. Why did they feel so strange? And why was Betty's dress torn? What's up, creeps? Welcome back. This week we're going to be talking about another alien story, of course. We are going to be talking about the first publicized alien abduction in the United States. This happened starting on September 19th, 1961, and happened to Betty and Barney Hill. Now, again, these crazy stories, it all seems to happen 50s, 60s. It's kind of the age of the galactic kind of awareness, I'll say. And it really is an interesting story. This happens pre-Mothman. So we get stories with Mothman that involve Indrid Cold. We talk about, there might have been involving extraterrestrials, things of that nature. So that happens after this. So this is quite the story, I think, because it has two credible beings that have something to lose by telling their story. And it's still, to this day, people talk about it. It hasn't gone away just because of, I believe, the credibility of this story. These two individuals are what I consider an all-American couple. They are an older couple. However, they are fairly normal people. Barney is a postal worker. He's part of the NAACP. He is one of kind of the lead speakers within his group, and he's a World War II veteran. Now, Betty is a social worker. She's a civil rights advocate, I'll say. And these guys were taking a chance by ruffling the feathers because they are an interracial couple in the 60s. Because in the 60s, for whatever reason, it's still a big deal. Now, not only does it involve Barney and Betty, but their dog, Delcy, was also in the car. Now, through this whole story, I remember when I first saw a photograph of Barney and Betty Hill, and it has Delcy in the picture. She's kind of a plump dachshund. She's cute as a bug's ear. And my first response was, but what happened to the dog? That's all I care about. It's like watching a movie. Everybody else can be grossly murdered, and all you want to know is, if they hurt the dog, did they hurt the dog? What happened to the dog? So don't worry, we'll talk about that. We'll get there. Now, these two had lives prior, of course, to this happening. This was Barney's second marriage. And, they're older. These are not like young kids that are coming up with some fantastical reason to be famous. It really doesn't make sense. Betty is a very intelligent older woman. She is, they describe her when you talk about other people interviewing about her. She is willing to stand her ground. She is opinionated. I love hearing her talk because she has that typical New England accent, park the car. Please excuse my Wisconsin trying to do New England accent, but I love it. I love the way she sounds. And they both seem like very normal people. Now, this story, if you decide to research, has a few other names. Of course, it goes by either the Hill Abduction or the Zeta Reticuli incident. So those are other things that you can take a look at. They are part of a Project Blue Book investigation. So that's also very interesting if you're wanting to go into all the other areas that we went at this to try and debunk what they saw. So this takes place in New Hampshire. They were on their way on Route 3, and they were on their way back to their home. Betty had heard that there was a hurricane coming up the coast, and they were concerned that this was going to basically manage to still hit them. So they wanted to come back from their vacation early so that they could prepare for that type of thing to happen. So let's break this down. Let's start with what we all want to know. What happened to the dog? Don't worry, folks. Delcy, their rescue dachshund, made it out just fine. She did start, she noticed she had a little more nervous behavior. Of course, Betty can recount that she was cowering under the seat. But don't worry, sometimes you hear stories about this. Well, they got home and they died. No, she did not die from any immediate concerns. She lived another 7 years. She was a rescue dachshund, and she then did unfortunately pass away. And that happens. But don't worry, the aliens did not kill Delcy. She's a dachshund. She's a mutant. Of course she's okay. I love dogs. Anyway, moving on. So now that we all know that very important piece of information, we can now actually dive into the rest of this investigation or topic discussion. Now, after returning home, there were several things that happened. They got home from this very odd night, 2 hours of time missing. They both showered. They felt contaminated of some sort. And this is by listening to interviews of these two describing they felt like they were contaminated. They were dirty. Now, granted, they were on the road. Sometimes you feel icky afterwards, but they did. They came home and they showered. They changed, and this is kind of where things started to really be odd. So Barney, a very normal individual, he said, now this is kind of strange, he said that he was obsessed with examining his genitals. Now, I know that sounds weird, but every time we hear about an alien abduction, they seem to be obsessed with our reproductive organs. So that's the first thing that really is noted, that he came home, he showered, and that he just felt like he needed to investigate his situation down there and figure out what was going on. The second part was Betty. Now, there's a few things that Betty noticed. First of all, her dress was torn, and her earrings, her blue earrings, were missing. And she thought, what is going on here? She noticed a pink powder on the dress. So she thought, I need to just throw this dress away. She throws it away, and then immediately, she has this concern, I should hang on to this. Hangs the dress outside, and all the pink powder is gone because of the wind. So now that part of evidence is gone. This dress has still been kept and is part of an archives. And the part that I found interesting is I own a dress. I like to collect vintage clothing, and I own a dress pretty much the same color, almost the same pattern, with a slightly different cut, I believe, due to the era of which it was made. But same length and the same slight discoloring because I believe of the purple dye. Now, mine is not torn. I was not abducted by aliens. However, what happened to this dress? I want to see it. If I wear it, are aliens going to get me? I find it very interesting. So that was the first part. But just remember about the earrings. Another interesting part is that both Barney and Betty's watch never worked from that point forward. Now, a part of kind of the information that I could not find is what time was on the watches. What did they both stop at the same time? What's going on here? I couldn't necessarily try to find the time that what stopped on the watches. It's kind of like the Titanic, right? The pocket watches that they found, similar times were when the watches stopped because of the crazy tragedy that was happening. So I wanted to know that piece of information, but I couldn't find it. Now the car, their 1957 Bel Air, a very popular car of the time. And, I think that's the same car from Mothman. Now that I don't have any notes on this one, but I'm just thinking about it. I believe it was the same car as Mothman. It was a very, very popular vehicle and, mass produced. So do aliens have something to do with the Bel Air? Oh, here we go. Okay, we'll come back to that. So on their 57 Bel Air, they noticed little circular, not dents, but imperfections that were now in the trunk of, the paint of their car. And when they would take a compass and put it near it, the compass would go cattywampus. Now, why did they take a compass? So Betty immediately felt, this is something I need to look into. She had a very kind of curious type of mind she needed to figure out, but also what's happening. She needed to rationalize it. She has that type of mind. So she reached out to her sister first. And because her sister had a situation with a potential flying saucer, and it turns out that someone close to her, someone that they contacted, and he said, you need to take a compass and put it near it, and that's how you'll find out basically about contamination. But if you think about it, a compass will not tell you if it's contaminated. A compass is going to tell you what sort of electromagnetic field something is giving off. It's like if you take a magnet and you put it underneath a compass, it'll just go crazy. So why would they tell him that? There's a piece of information that somebody already knew. That's why. Aliens, right? Here we go. Now, of course, there was a big government investigation about this because this story popped off. It was on the front page news for many days. I think she said 5 days. I say she, Betty, in her interview, 5 days. And they went through lie detector tests. They were questioned. They went on shows. Like, people were really trying to essentially prove that these people were either nuts or that this was a hoax of some kind, because nobody can bend their noodle around the fact that they might have been abducted by aliens. Another interesting part of information that I found was an interview, actually, that Betty was talking. This was in her older years, and she's talking about kind of the days following, the weeks following what happened to them. She says 6 weeks following the investigation, they come into the kitchen and they notice they come back. Now they're coming back from, I believe, their dinner is what she said. There was a pile of leaves on the kitchen table. In that pile of leaves, while they're cleaning it up, there are her blue earrings. How did they get there? Where did they come from? Did the alien say, hey, these are pretty earrings, she's going to want these back? What? I think it's crazy. I love that part of the story. Can you imagine coming home, there's a pile of leaves in your kitchen, like, hey, where'd those earrings come from? Oh my God, that was when I was abducted by aliens. Crazy. So they try and debunk it amongst themselves. They say, let's draw a picture of what we saw, but not while we're sitting together. We're going to do it individually and compare notes, essentially, is what they're looking for. So they go off, they draw what they think they saw, and then they meet back. And the drawing is almost identical. Now, again, you're trying to prove that these two people may have become either become crazy or they're trying to become famous. But they're trying to debunk it themselves, which is also interesting, which kind of lets me know, like, they're not, I don't know. You listen to them talk, you see them, and it just blows my mind. They don't look weird. They don't look strange. It's like the kids with Mothman. You look at them, they're not some oddball, someone trying to be famous, like today, trying to create a hoax. They look fairly normal kids. And these two look normal, and they're older, and they have normal jobs. If they truly were trying to protect their reputation, they would have never have brought this to the public. You have an interracial couple in the 60s claiming that they were abducted by aliens. None of those things should be together of that time frame, because that they're just trying to get through. They're trying to prove a point, in a civil sense. Why do this to yourself? But they did. They're like, no, people got to know. And they went to the public with it. So once all this became public, I think that the government scrambled to basically, I don't want to say cover it up, but debunk it to the public, which I guess in turn does cover it up. So this became a part of Project Blue Book. Now, any of those other fellow alien people out there that really find it interesting, you will have heard of Project Blue Book before. So the Air Force has a UFO research project called Project Blue Book. So they came out and tried to investigate what had happened. And they basically tried to say that the Hills had probably misidentified what they had seen, and that it was the planet Jupiter. This is not an unidentified flying object. Now, they later changed it to an optical condition, and then they changed it to insufficient data. So, why change it if you can say, hey, nope, it was Jupiter, boop, and then end it, but they can't. So that's an interesting part of the government trying to investigate what may have happened. A scary part of reading into this story is when you discover the Barney and Betty tapes of them being hypnotized, trying to recount exactly what happened. And it's a way of, when you're hypnotized, I've never been, I'm too afraid to do it, but it's supposed to bring out repressed memories and bring those to the forward so that you can get them out. So they both are hypnotized individually by a very famous person. I don't want to say a very famous person, but someone who that's their game. They do this for government work too. And listening to these two, specifically Barney, now they both are terrified. Now, this takes him a little while to get into their mojo, and you can all of a sudden he's recounting, and they sound scared. It gives me goosebumps thinking about it. Barney is just bubbling about how he's trying to be strong because he doesn't want Betty to be afraid, and he's trying to protect her. And keep in mind, he's a World War II veteran, so there's that as well. Now, when you listen to Betty, same thing. She's already, when she's into her hypnotized zone, her voice is fluttery, which is very not like her. If you listen to her interviews, she's kind of that typical New England personality. Kind of blunt. This is, we're talking right now, talks to you. And that was not the case. Her voice becomes fluttery. She starts crying. She starts sobbing. And you can tell, she's scared. She's legit scared. And this was done individually. And yet their stories under that hypnosis are so similar, but individual yet, on what they did to Barney and what they did to Betty. Betty talks about her navel and how she thought they just wanted to do a basic examination, and basically she says they were just here to study us, but she starts talking about what they did and where they're going, and she becomes so fearful. And that's what scares everybody, because it's like, what are you doing? Are you taking samples? It's terrifying to listen to that. I was fine with the story until I started listening to the tapes of them being hypnotized, and their fear made me feel fearful, and I just can't get that sound out of my head. And Betty, she would have dreams. She would have these really vivid dreams following what happened, and they happened in a row. Not like, one here, 1 month later. It was several days in a row. And she would recall this great detail and intensity of what was happening. And then after 5 days, they stopped and they never came back. They never returned. And this just is really what filled her brain with trying to investigate what happened. And I can't imagine. You can never get that out of your head. And then they describe the beings. They draw them, and you can tell this is one of the first incidents of the Greys. I know that when you see the drawing, it's just pencil on paper, but this is what the Greys look like. Those long eyes, they're set apart, the odd-shaped head. This is what we imagine as the Greys. Her description is that they're nearly human. They have black hair, and that's the only part that's, I think, is really different about the Greys, because we all think of them as like this bulbous head. That they had black hair, dark eyes, they had prominent noses, and bluish lips. Their skin was grayish in color. So could this be another species of the Greys? I don't know, but it was very interesting to hear this was one of the stories of that first description. Now, Barney's description, he was also terrified while going into this description. And then under hypnosis, it was similar in his description. However, I remember listening to him, and this is obviously a recount, but he's like, oh, those eyes, they're in my brain. And you can hear him. He is very upset. And he had things happen to him that were different than Betty. Betty had more of a kind of normal, I'll say quote unquote, normal exam, where it's like, took a little bit of her hair. They kind of scraped the dry skin off her hands, her nail clippings. The navel one, though, she was very painful, uncomfortable. She said the being put their hand kind of over near their face and that the pain went away. And then Barney, who is a very respectable man, is now trying to describe what happened to him. And his exam was a little more fragmented when it comes to talking about it, but he describes that, I'm going to read something. A cup-like device was placed over his genitals. He did not experience an orgasm, though Barney thought that a sperm sample had been taken. So they're messing with reproduction. It totally, like, what else are you going to get from down there? Like, come on. Now, this part is, it's the usual. The alien with the whole butt thing, and I just can't. It seems like every time I read about some sort of alien description, they talk about it. So, a tube cylinder was inserted into his anus and quickly removed. Again, why are you obsessed with our butt? I don't know. Aliens, man. So, we continue on the conversation of these two under hypnosis, individual descriptions, not under hypnosis. It's matchy all the way. And clearly, they are upset by this. It's messed with their noodle that they are trying to debunk it and yet prove that it happened all at the same time. Now, when all this was done, they're returned to their vehicle, and they had a series again of the bloops and the bleeps and the buzzing, and they return to their consciousness, and they come back home. Now, I do want to know where Delcy was this whole time. coming back to the dog. What happened to the dog? Like, she's just hanging out the whole time terrified? Or did they check her out too? Or they're like, no, dogs are cool. We already know about them. Or like, no, we're not touching them. I just am curious about that. Ultimately, the conclusion of this story is that people feel that it happened. They tried everything. They matched up star patterns. Betty was so adamant about proving that this had happened to them. She continued her legacy. She would go to events, she would go to talks, and she lived to a ripe old age. Now, unfortunately, Barney did pass away. Not long. I'll say not long. It was years after, and unfortunately, he didn't make it out as long as she did, because he died when he was only 46, and Betty lived to the ripe old age of 85, and that's just plenty of time for them to continue their story. For her at least. The Barney and Betty alien abduction incident is really something I recommend that you guys check out. If you are into the alien story, especially how it kind of all started and kicked off here in the States, I would highly recommend looking into this. Barney and Betty Hill happened in New Hampshire. You'll see a picture of them with Delcy. It usually pops up everywhere. I'm even including Delcy in the photo for this episode, so you'll kind of see the back of her, I believe. And this influences so many things that we've seen in movies, TV shows. The big one I can think of, like right off the top of my head, is American Horror Story. It was one of the first seasons, if not the first season, and it has one of the main characters. It's an interracial couple. He's clearly being abducted by aliens. You can hear the hissing, the bright lights, the whole 9 yards. That's a direct nod to Barney and Betty Hill. There's been movies about it. The UFO Incident, I believe it's called, with James Earl Jones. He's like a kid. I want to say kid. He's a very young man in that movie. He's the star, I'll say, absolutely. The gal that they got to play, Betty, is probably why she didn't become a big star. But totally my opinion. I'm going to get off on a tangent on that. And really a cool thing that I think you should check out. As we wrap up our January theme of aliens, we really enjoyed diving into this story with you guys. I know our podcasts are getting a little longer. I've got more to talk about, so enjoy them. I hope you guys do some research yourselves, read into this, and tell us, do you believe in aliens? Stay tuned. We're coming into February. Again, Cult of the Month is going to be the first Friday of February. We're going to try to stick to an interesting theme for February. And please follow us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Please add Creepy Confidential. If you're listening here on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. Leave us a comment. We want to hear from you creeps. So stay tuned and come back to Creepy Confidential.